No, okay.
All right.
All right, it's 3:45. We're going to get started. Welcome to How Did I Become the Ringmaster? The Art of Juggling Digital Projects. We invite you all to join the conversation today on Twitter with hashtag MCN Ringmasters and obviously MCN 2015. We are going to take a moment to introduce ourselves if we don't know all of you already. My name's Megan Estep. I am a social media manager at the National Gallery of Art. I'm formerly of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., where I managed K-12 digital and educator initiatives. And so I was more of a project manager in that role and more of a less traditional project manager now.
Sure. I apologize in advance. We're not sitting in the order that we are indicated up there.
This is not Scott.
I'm not Scott. I'm Susan Wigodner. I'm the web and digital project manager at the Field Museum in Chicago. I've been at the Field for about 7 months, where I manage general website maintenance priorities, some exhibition microsites. And prior to being at the Field, I was the exhibition media manager at the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York, working to open the museum and dealing with media projects for opening.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'm Laura Hoffman, and I am the manager of K-12 digital and educator initiatives at the Phillips Collection. I just started a month ago, and so you'll be hearing two different perspectives in that regard. But also before then, I was working at the National Museum of Women in the Arts for about 5 years. I started there project managing their website redesign, and from there I started to manage all of the digital engagement, which ranged from social media, websites, interactives across the gamut. So you'll be hearing a little, this is just the nature of the digital world in museums. There's
Swapping jobs.
Lots of swapping.
Hi, thanks for coming today. My name is Scott Gillam. I'm the manager of digital platforms for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. We recently opened in September of 2014. It's the first national museum in 40 years. 46,000 square feet of exhibit space. I'm responsible for enterprise content management, the mobile app, the website, social media, anything publishing to a digital platform, just the small things.
A few things. Hi, I'm Jen Schmitt. I'm the head of information technology and electronic communications at DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum, longest title and place name ever. I am responsible for both internal network administration, website, what else? Social media. I'm also involved in some evaluation projects, and generally wear a lot of hats. So I can talk both from the IT side of the house as well as some of the digital engagement projects.
So this is our list of agenda items for the day, and we really want to preface the session with a couple of things. And the first is that we're not going to be doing Project Management 101. We're more here to think about what our lives are like as project managers and what processes we go through, the lessons that we learn by managing hard things, and what resources and tools we can gather together. So I'm a museum educator by training, so I'm going to turn it right on to you guys immediately. So I want to ask and just shout out a few words. What comes to mind if I say, what is a project? Anyone? Huge. Work? Collaborative? Resources? Temporary? Goals? Deliverables? Awesome. So the Project Management Institute defines a project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So no one said, or this doesn't say huge, but I think that probably should be added in there. What is project management? Back on you. Sorry? Herding cats.
Making it happen.
Making it happen. Amen. So we have two ways that we're looking at project management today. The first is from the Definitive Guide to Project Management. Is it definitive? Maybe we can decide that. Which says that it's really about carefully projecting and planning, organizing, motivating, and controlling resources. Do we have control? To achieve specific goals and meet specific success criteria. And then this great line from Rita Mulcahy, who says, it's both a science and an art, and it follows a systematic process. So just some things to noodle on there. Again, we're not going to really dive too deeply into defining these different methodologies for how to manage projects. And if anyone wants to speak about this or has questions about each of them, we'd be more than happy to touch more. But I just want to hit short definitions. These are 3 methodologies that we'll be talking about in our sort of case studies and our examples. Waterfall is really the most traditional model of development. It's a step-by-step, and it's literally like a waterfall. You can watch your project trickle down. And then Agile. Did anyone go to the Agile workshop yesterday? Couple hands. Awesome. Really, it's what it is. It's about agility. And features include short-term delivery cycles, agile requirements, a really dynamic team culture, and less restrictive project control. And then there's obviously the hybrid model, and that's really just a mix of what works best for you and your team. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is that we're coming at this with some assumptions. Today, we are kind of imagining that you're sitting in your office and your boss has just walked in and said, why don't you build a website? Or you've just walked out of a board meeting and your board member says, we really think we need a microsite for this exhibition. Or it's just a whim. There's not really, sometimes there's strategy behind things, sometimes it's just a one-off project. Projects come from many places, and we're not here to talk about that strategic planning process or conceptualization, but things that are already in motion. And now I turn it over to Laura.
So instead of having one moderator, we thought, let's mix it up a little bit, make it really conversational. So for the rest of the time, we're going to be going through, because we are project managers, in a very structured manner, a loose, very fluid conversation where we'll take turns kind of asking each other questions, and also so you guys can think about it on your end as well. So getting started, I want you guys first just to think on your own what it means for you guys for project management and what it looks like at your institution. And then I'll have you guys briefly explain what it looks like at your institutions.
How many digital project managers do we have in the crowd?
Ah,
Basically everybody.
So what's going on with folks?
Oh,
What's about your team?
oh.
New me?
Well, it's very different for me because starting at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, which moving forward I will call NIMWA because it's a very long title, I was really working with everyone on staff because I was doing digital engagement. It really required working with all departments. And now that I'm in a more blended position where it's really it's under education and doing digital work with teachers and providing resources there, I'm learning more how that works in that newer place, and it's also a larger institution. So for me, I'm trying to take all the lessons learned, which we'll talk more about later, and applying it to this new institution.
I'll jump in. So at the 9/11 Memorial, project management for me was managing consultants. What had they delivered, making sure that our team was reviewing it on time, and then managing that implementation. Were we happy with what our consultants had delivered? In my new role at the Field Museum, I work as part of more of a boutique shop team with a developer. We're hiring a new designer, a director, and so together we create these exhibition microsites and manage priorities for the website. So I'm really transitioning in my own kind of definition as a project manager, doing one and the other.
And when I was at the Phillips, it occurred to me earlier that the only way I could define what project management looked like was just saying the word fluid and flexible. We had no understanding of anything but. It was fine to stop and start a project. We had to be on our feet and on our toes. We had to understand that sometimes you work with one contractor and 6 months later you might work with a different one, and things just changed. And that was the benefit of the Phillips is a small museum. There's about 70 full-time staff members. So it was really it was a nimble place, and that's how projects worked.
Project management at DeCordova can mean a lot of things. I'm a department of 1.2. I have a helper 2 days a week. And so it can mean managing the contractors. We're currently upgrading our finance server. And so it's both managing in-house the finance team's expectations and their schedule needs. It also means dealing with an external for-profit company that may not understand the specificity that comes with museum territory. So it's speaking multiple languages sometimes, and being able to manage these different constituencies and keeping them all in the game together.
Sure. I'm lucky. I'm the only non-project manager here. But I mean, project management for us is really resource management. We've got a small skeletal team. There's no redundancy. We've got a team of 6. One is content related, one is back end, one is front end, one is database, and one is mobile. So project management in our environment is really about resources and how we leverage all of the other departments in order to help us achieve our goals. We're lucky enough that within our organization, Digital Platforms is a peer department with communications, with research and curation, with exhibits. So that allows us to say no when we have to, and say yes when we want to. But sometimes, of course, your arm gets twisted anyways.
So a lot of similarities already. Okay, so now you have your project and we want to think about defining the project. So I want that to be more of kind of a rhetorical question to think about this kind of big idea of you're given a project, now how do you go about defining scope? So now we're going to unpack that a bit. So when you're tasked with a project, couldn't resist good Office Space reference. What are those first steps that you guys take when you're given a new project?
I start asking questions. When does it have to be done? What's the budget? Are sort of the very, very basic things. Where do we go from there?
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's a really interesting opportunity to start collaborating across the museum and think about who you need to reach out to. Do you know who your IT director is? Have you ever talked to them before? Do you need a contact in curatorial and who that person is? Start building those relationships right away and make them strong and have good contacts with your colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, it's always important to discuss, along with budget and timeline, is what is the problem you're really trying to solve? Because before that kickoff, you need to really make sure that everybody's coming to the table with a fresh sense of what the actual product you actually want to deliver for your visitor.
And goals.
Yeah.
And having goals.
Because a lot of times you're presented with a solution that you're expected to deliver,
Right.
and not necessarily knowing what the details are on the problem that you're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
I think we think through sort of the work streams too, whether that's content, design, development, what's the IT coordination going to be like. Not all projects may have all of those things, but a lot of them will have many of them, and that will impact who your team is and who you'll be working with as part of that project.
And so what are your goals as that project manager at this point when you're really getting started?
I think the main thing is to understand what the scope is. You both want to think expansively. What's the big picture? What's the wish list? What's everything that could possibly go into this project? And then also, what are your restrictions? And you need to narrow it down, but you also don't want to cut off opportunities. And so it's a juggling act sometimes, but you need to be able to communicate, figure out those questions and then communicate it to the rest of the team.
I think the managing expectations really comes into play there as well. If you have 3 months and you need to build a whole new website, to me that would say, oh my gosh, that's not enough time. Like, we're gonna have to take this, either we need more time or we need to do a piece of that project in 3 months. We probably can't accomplish all of it.
Yeah, having a really clear sense of your capacity So knowing what your developers can do, which means having a really good relationship with your team. And that collaboration and communication.
Yeah, and getting started, I think that can be often really difficult. You know, it can be very daunting to start a large project. So being that person who has thought about those things and is getting the ball rolling on it.
Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Scott, it's your turn.
So when you're getting ready to actually start implementing your project, what do you start?
Something that we did at the Phillips, which worked really well for us with the project that I managed for about 2.5 years, was a teacher resource website called Prism K-12, and I saw it from build to it exists, and something that we did was set tiny milestones. And for us, it was really important to understand that sometimes we would hit those, and for me to communicate to other people on my team that we might not always hit those milestones, and that you might have to backtrack a couple of times. But as a project manager, I'm not always just managing people and managing a project, but I'm also teaching them that these are things that we have to get accomplished to do the next thing, or we actually have to change X, Y, and Z because it doesn't work for our audience. And just to keep in that real fluid vein.
I think for me, it's about defining the roles in your team and the responsibilities so that it's not a surprise to them what they're doing, or when I'm sending nagging emails, they know to expect them from me. So
I think one thing that's important is dealing with the reality of being in museums, that our museums are different from some traditional workplaces. And so taking that into account when you're dealing with a project, it may not look like a traditional project management, but because you're dealing with the restrictions placed on where we work.
When you're working with outsiders or outside providers, how do you adjust for the reality of working with a museum?
Well, I always work in places where we rely on outside vendors, and that's a very important thing. And I learned that it's as important getting the institutional buy-in as it is having your vendors as an ally too, because I've been in the case where I've had unresponsive developers, and you really have to foster those relationships, and it takes the time, but it makes all the difference in a project. So building that relationship is as important.
I'm sort of formulating thoughts. I think that sometimes working with consultants can be amazing because they bring these ideas and goals and visions that you might not have thought of because you're so wrapped up in your day-to-day. And that's really different, I think, from working with an internal team where you are working with the same people day in and day out, and you're sort of all trying to be creative, but you kind of know where each other might go based on that. I think that consultants also have a lot of challenges that they don't necessarily know your institutional voice right away. They don't necessarily hold the same initial vision that your institution might think, oh, of course they understand this. And so really communicating, like, this is our way of looking at the world. These are the things that we value. I think kind of taking that time in the beginning to orient your consultants to how you want to work and how you hope that they will work with you can really help you in the long term.
I know when we did our website redesign at NIMWA, we were using a company that it was their first art museum that they'd ever worked with. And so there was a huge learning process because they didn't realize that we needed credit lines and they needed to sometimes be very, very long, or you couldn't auto crop because we had a lot of nudes and it would crop things in very awkward positions. So it was a learning experience for them as much because they wanted to learn, they wanted to work with more museums. So it was kind of a good learning experience on both ends, because that was the first time I had worked with a big firm like that as well. So that was interesting. And I think also the important part I learned was I needed to, and we talked about this when we were prepping for this, we feel like translators, because if you don't know the technical specs and you're working with outsiders who are doing all technical, then there's a lot of miscommunication and it can cause a lot of extra work all around.
I think also if you're lucky, you can get outside consultants who do understand and can provide an external pair of eyes that are perhaps less political. We've been very fortunate in the partnership we have with, we have a Drupal-based website. We do most of the content management, but when there is a Drupal tweak on the back end, we still rely on them to go in and make the edits. And they're knowledgeable enough now about our workflow and what we are trying to produce to say, this doesn't work for you, and maybe something else would be better, and that they're good for suggesting things. And so I think having that external perspective can be a help as well as sometimes a hindrance if they don't understand, but when they do, it can be really, really a boon for you.
One of the other things, I think, with working with a provider that's familiar with museums, it can be a blessing and a curse. Sometimes they'll make assumptions that will lead you down the same path and not improve. So how do you, when you're managing projects, sometimes you have a relationship with a third-party provider where you may not get the honest answer because they're more interested in the contract than they are in actually innovating. So how do you create space for innovation?
We actually had the opposite. We created space for innovation that didn't happen. We had a previous web designer who had promised that they could make Razor's Edge talk to Drupal, which I'm sure people
We've all been told that one.
Yes, we've all heard that line, and they promised, and they did not come through. But we wanted to try to be expansive in our thinking and create something new that worked, and unfortunately, it didn't. So.
When we were working on the mobile app for the museum, we decided to innovate using iBeacons. And what that came through was a design exercise where, working with Acoustiguide, the style at the time was QR codes, which is really kind of a stopgap technology, and it's not very enjoyable for visitors. So we ended up going through sort of an iterative process of prototyping, and we ended up doing a joint innovation project with them where we were the largest install of iBeacons in North America with them. So, really working closely with a provider and challenging them can sometimes yield really amazing results, and it's certainly not the end of the road for us, but we're certainly happier to be in a better space for visitors.
Mm-hmm.
I think change up your process too. When I was working at the 9/11 Memorial, that's project-based. We're building a new museum. Literally every day we're doing something that moves you to that goal. And so every day was really different. And so a year, 3 months before we opened, I was doing a ton of QA testing. And a year before that, pretty much my whole time was taken up in meetings where I tried to get people to approve things so I could approve them for my consultants. But now I'm working in a job that is a little bit more cyclical, that we do the same thing, but we do it for different microsites, for different exhibitions, or people ask us about making different kinds of changes on the website, and we have to figure out how to respond to those. And so, but I think in both places, you sort of have a chance to say, you know what, I tried this process, and I tried this method of tracking, and that kind of worked, but it wasn't great, and I think that we can do better. And luckily, I have a boss who I think is here and is very encouraging of trying those things out, and we're trying not to get stuck in a this sort of work, let's just do it again. So kind of trying to go to workshops about Agile or read more about what other people are doing, try out what corporations might be doing to manage their own projects, for me has been really helpful in terms of thinking through other ways to jump into a project and get things done.
And I know, I always think about it, digital as being more fluid than print. You know, once you print something out, it's out there and it's very difficult to change and expensive. Digital, while still very expensive, you can think of it more fluidly and, as Susan was saying, stop and test things and maybe move that next piece onto the next phase and make it not just this one and done deal.
Do you have another question, or are you passing to me?
Passing the mic.
Passing the baton.
So I think there's so much we go through in terms of implementing our projects, and I said I want to ask the questions about what happens after your project, because I feel like in some ways I never really get to do that part. When you open a museum, you're sort of trying to catch up, and then now I've been in a new job and I don't totally know what happens after all of my projects. So kind of wondering, so you take this time, you define your project, but how do you measure success? How do you look back and say this project went well or it didn't?
I think that's the biggest reason why you create goals and outcomes in the first place, because otherwise you don't have anything to measure it by. And I know for us at the Phillips, it was really, really important to always have strong goals for the work that we did. It still is important for me to do the same at the National Gallery. And those are the measurables in which you can say, is this a success? Is my audience using it for X reason? Do my teachers like this website? Why not? What can we do differently? Yeah.
I think that you nailed it. You nailed it. But I do think there's so much metrics out there for digital that you could get really lost in it. So if you don't have those goals to go back to, and also the other reality is you work so hard to get a project done, and then it's out there, and it's so easy to just be like, okay, let's move on to the next one because we're so strapped for time. So really taking the time to do postmortems and do strategy and see how things aligned and how you're going to keep going with things, even though that can be really difficult in the reality of all the other projects that you've been putting off to get this one done.
Well, and also sometimes people just don't want to return to something, especially if it was hard. What were the other words we shouted out? Did anyone say boring? No, I don't think so. But if you've done a project and it really just took all your time and you didn't like it, then all of a sudden you don't really want it, you finished it, you don't really want to deal with it anymore. You're kind of like, okay, it's over. It's out of my picture.
Well, it's out of your picture.
Right.
Maybe it's out in the museum and someone has to make sure that it's working and that people are using it, or...
You know, on a very basic level, one measure of success for me is it working? Because when you're working at the network and the servers and all of that, if I'm preventing somebody else from getting their job done, then my project hasn't been successful. So I need, the less they're reaching out to me for help, the more successful I've been.
In terms of, like when you speak of the postmortem, I mean, I guess one of the questions I would have as project managers, how do you maintain the interest and the momentum to get those postmortems done? Because I think that's certainly the challenge from leadership, is understanding, making sure that people actually cycle back to provide feedback on a project. But a lot of time there's not the institutional or motivational will to actually look back and actually measure success.
I mean, I know at my old museum in Nimwa, I had a social media team that was interdepartmental that I led, so I would have a fancy lunch once a year, and we do a big, giant look back and moving towards the future. So I find food to be a very powerful motivator, which is why you have snacks on your tables.
So what's something that you learned from the last project you did, or you're learning from a project that you're doing that you might use to do something different the next time you do a project?
I learned that I hate waterfall.
Tell us more, Scott.
Why?
Well, I think we were involved in a project. I was on the project for 4.5 years. So it was a the base building, the exhibitry, the collecting policy, enterprise content management, everything was being built all at the same time. So we had about 96 concurrent projects. And 9 media producers creating software scopes from around the world along with our internal scopes. So we had a massive amount of Microsoft projects in Waterfall. And I can honestly say that our team was a little bit more self-defining. So we kind of moved into a hybrid, iterative approach to design and with media producers, and that certainly helped. I know in terms of a lot of the other departments within the organization were very strapped into Waterfall, and that carries a lot of risk with it, especially when you're opening large galleries all at the same time. It all builds up to one point, and its success or failure can be quite traumatic. Whereas now we're moving even further towards an agile approach where it'll be more iterative and more user-driven. So.
I would say that if you take nothing else away from this presentation, it's that if a consultant comes to you and says, we want to use a waterfall method, you at least know to think about that and think about your institution and if that will work for you. And I know that it has not purely worked for me in the past, but when I was just starting out, I didn't know enough to say, that's not going to work for this place where I am. And so kind of making sure that you understand what the kind of methodologies and buzzwords that people are throwing around at you, I think is really valuable as well.
And how fast it's changing, because when I first started for the website redesign, I know our outside firm was using Waterfall, but that was back in 2011. So it's changed fast and it's changed quickly, and I'd say now we definitely do more of a hybrid approach now that we're on our own and thinking about that. And I know for me, switching jobs, I was working on such a more macro level, working with everyone in the museum, and now I'm working in education. So I'm really looking to take all those skills that I got, mostly working with different people and how to get things done quickly and efficiently in museums, which are not by definition quick or efficient, and utilizing that with a new staff and within a new role. So I'm really trying to, and also utilizing colleagues who
Yeah, Laura asked me so many questions.
are a wealth of knowledge, which I recommend.
Other learnings, takeaways?
You asked the question again.
Megan just asked me to ask the question again. I asked, what's something you learned from your last project, something you wish you knew, something you're going to do differently next time you do a project?
I guess something that I learned that I had to be okay with, and maybe others this resonates, that projects don't necessarily finish. And you have to get over that, because things happen and budgets go away or grants don't get funded, and things change. And so sometimes a dream that you have, and it changes, and you have to just be flexible. It's just as much about your methodology in doing the project as it is it's a mindset too. And I think managing something digital teaches you that flexibility.
Now, digital moves so quickly that I've learned really thinking about sustainability after the fact. So for me, that was maybe taking this original scope, but thinking about how can it have a built-in flexibility so we can try and think about using it for more than just a year.
Yeah, how do you kind of, even if you can't future-proof, if you're going to spend a bunch of time doing something, can you put that towards the next thing you have to do? So I work on microsites, and so we're really trying to start thinking about, if we're doing this for one, how can we use some of that framework to lead to the next one, to kind of diminish time spent kind of figuring out a framework, or do a little less coding, or whatever that might be, which sounds simple, but I think it can be really hard, and things all have different requirements and things you want out of them, but just having that on your radar, I think, can help move it forward.
Yeah, I think focusing on developing work that ends up going into a toolkit that you can re-leverage is certainly making your projects more modular, so that you can reformat and reuse content is critical, especially with the amount of formats that it can take, whether it's an EPUB, whether it's a website content, whether it's something you want to deliver for some other type of transmedia delivery.
I'm going to let Jennifer jump in.
So our last section is about keeping your project moving. You know, we can all hit those points in a project where it just grinds to a halt. You're waiting for one person to deliver something that's just not happening. And I confess I've been that person, that, you know, you have so many things going on that something has to become the lowest priority, and a project grinds to a halt. And some of the ways that I've found to at least lighten that load, or at least, you know, make things not stop to a dead halt, is in the relationships you've built beforehand. And so why is relationship building important to the project management system? I think it's easier for somebody to dismiss you if they don't really have a relationship with you. And one of the ways I try to prevent that is, as part of IT, I go on walkabouts and I'm walking through our campus, talking to everyone and just trying to figure out what they're doing, what they're working on, what their needs are, and how I can help, so that when we're actually on a project together, I know what their burden is, I know what their workload is, and so I'm not asking too much of them, but I can still get the answers I need in a timely manner. How do you guys use relationship building?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's maybe not recognized most in project management is all the tasks that actually don't fall under project management. When you have to socialize the value of a project, when you have to socialize or get people's motivation to actually get buy-in, sometimes that's the work that's most critical to the project's success, and you'll never find it on a spreadsheet.
I think someone put it best when they said herding cats, so that is the default. So how can you change it from herding cats to building allies? And I learned that over my 5 years at NIMWA, that the more allies I had, the more projects I got done and more efficiently, and I knew who would help me get it done, how to get the funding. So I think that's the most important thing, and takes the most time, and something that I really want to build up in my new position is building and finding those allies.
So you're talking about trust.
Yes.
We've been talking about this kind of internally, kind of who's on our own staffs that we work with, and I think that you also really have to build good relationships and rapport with your consultants, even though they're not like sitting with you every day. I have been in a place where I have amazing relationships with consultants, and also been put in a position where I literally have to call them and be like, you didn't do a good job with this, my director won't accept it, I need you to spend all this extra time and money to do this, and I'm the one that has to make that phone call. And so you get put in a really hard position sometimes as a project manager, and being able to kind of communicate kind of as nicely as you can and as firmly as you can sometimes, I think can go a long way. But having that like mutual respect for people that you're working with is really important. And so that means that like I've learned that sometimes I have to fight with my boss to say like, you know what, we really do have to pay them more for this because this changing scope is your fault. And that's a hard thing to say, but it goes both ways. So.
And we talked about being that translator. Mm-hmm. And you have to do that on staff so much, because I find sometimes when I get people who aren't agreeing, it's more just that they're not understanding, because they don't understand necessarily the technical problems that are happening, that aren't the fancy things, but just the bugs that need to be fixed that make it a much more complex project than just what they might think. So being that translator between the consultant and the higher ups at, sometimes that's the director of your museum, and really being able to speak the tech, but also be able to speak it in a very easy way without jargon. It's just also an interesting point that you mentioned, because some of my contractors I've worked with, and I think this is a big thing, they're digital, so you don't necessarily ever meet them in person. I worked with a developer who, for like 4 years, and I never met him in person. So that can make it a little harder to say like, hey, did you do that thing? Because normally I can go into an office and be like, hey, Susan, but you can't do that. So I think being able to get that same relationship when you're not physically in the office with an outside contractor is really important.
And I think people don't always feel real when they might be like in another city, or I've worked with like developers in Poland who I only talk to at 8 o'clock in the morning because of the time difference. Like, but there's still people that you have to deal with to get your work done. And so kind of poking and making sure that you're communicating across those lines has been super valuable for me.
Guys, you guys were really smart. I don't have anything else to say.
I guess another way is just the relationships is it's an opportunity. I find sometimes I forget that I may be speaking a language that some of my colleagues don't. And if there's a way to bring everybody into the same playing field, that it helps. It can be a teaching moment. I mean, we're all really smart people who work at museums in my experience, but some are more willing to work with digital than others. And so you can often take what can be a misunderstanding and turn it into a learning moment so that, you know, the next time around, they're willing to trust you because you helped them understand the last time.
Yeah, and speaking to that, sort of that education component, you know, hosting lunch and learns at your organization, something really casual, really informal, where you're talking about current projects, where you're talking about great projects that other museums are doing, is a great way to be able to socialize both new ideas and also to communicate the different values that most of the time when they're thinking of a digital project, many times it's coming from somewhere that's has no experience or doesn't have a level of depth that, you know, when they come to the social media team to talk about publishing, when they come to talk about mobile, you know, what's their experience with mobile versus what's their experience with other platforms. So it's really important to, you know, spend the time with whether it's your finance team or whether it's your comms team or whether it's your research and curation team, which often has like the best to gain from having, you know, access to your collection, whether it's linked open data, whether it's semantic metadata that you want to share with other institutions. But they don't really understand how that works. And the only way they can do that is through sharing and through education.
I think you only have something to gain by making yourself available to, you become more accessible to people. You become someone that, like, if they are going to miss a deadline, they're going to come tell you about it instead of avoiding you about it. In my department, we manage content creators on the website, people who can publish or author content. And so my colleague and I have started doing office hours where we have a set time every other week where we invite people who need help with what they're doing on the website to come in. And for us, that's kind of let us put it into our schedule, which helps us, but also says, like, we're here for you. We're not just like off in the basement somewhere and doing digital things and not able to help you fix the problem that you're having.
At the National Gallery, we have a social media collaborative, and it was formed by my predecessor, but it's a really great way for members from all around this huge museum to come together and share ideas for how they see social growing and things that come from their departments that I would never know about. Little tiny things that just are fantastic for visitors. And we meet once a month. And again, it's just all about, for me, especially being new, building relationships and getting buy-in from colleagues who might not necessarily want to contribute or want to be a part of something like social media. So yeah, it's like the office hours thing. It's just all about opening your door and making yourself accessible.
Yeah, definitely. I tried in my old position to be very approachable so that
Tried.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard because, you know, what you're talking about, sometimes when you are too approachable, then they're like, oh, we're talking like, what, the microwave's not working. So it's like, you know, sometimes you can be too approachable. But my old position, we were forming different teams to try and do that, where I'd have, interdepartmental social media team, but also different people, more big picture ideas, where it wasn't focused on technical, but they could still help plan what we were doing for digital and not be expected to know, or be just the ones doing the tweets or what have not. And we also had a group where it was just for people who enter web content from every single department. So we really tried to have spokespeople from every single department, so they felt like they were included and that they knew what was happening, and try to make it not siloed, because it's so easy for that to happen.
Do you want to make your comment about the decision makers? Because I love that. So Scott had pointed out that on some of his teams, he had to clarify roles, and it's not something that I had thought about before, where there are people who are advisors and we want your opinion, but then there are also people who actually get to make the decision, and that separating out so people know in advance that we really value your input and we need to know what you think, but you don't get to make the final decision. And that is something that I have come up against many times, but had not quite been able to verbalize in the same way. So I had appreciated that.
Well, I think that's has to do too with the size of your institution and the size of the project. If you're lucky enough to have a larger scope of work where you're creating a project charter, which can also help even if you are in a smaller institution, to be able to say, this is your core team, and you socialize that so people know who's making the real decisions. But then you also have an inclusive advisory committee that allows for people to be heard, because you don't know. Sometimes the solution can get contributed by one of the advisory members, but it really ends up having a definitive core team to be able to make the hard decisions, because everybody can't have everything. You have to keep scope creep within a reasonable amount. One of the ways that we've made space for innovation on other projects is, understanding that sometimes you have to kill your darlings. Certain scopes of the work will die on the vine, and you'll replace it with something else, because if you're doing iterative design and you're testing, you may find that some of the features that you're developing, whether it's for your website, whether it's for a mobile app, aren't really what's going to give the visitor what they want. There's a really great discussion next door just previous to this, talking about engagement, and how often when we're doing digital projects, we're measuring engagement by getting people to do what we want them to do, not necessarily trying to develop features that are for them for what they really want to do. And that means actually, having an iterative process when you're defining your projects to make sure that you're on target with what your visitors really want, not what you want to do for your visitors.
Preach.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm at MCN.
So now we've come to the moment in the afternoon when we share our resources. This is a not exhaustive list of tools that we've used on the bottom, and the top is a list of links where we'll be tweeting out our slide deck, so that you can click through these if you're interested. I love the "But I'm Not a Project Manager" article. It's really, really fantastic. And we've used all of these tools below, all the different platforms. Each of us has used at least one or two of these. And so if you have any questions about them or anything like that, we'd be happy to answer them after the session. And now we'll take your questions. Click on this mic and you can...
Shout it out.
We'll just repeat it.
I just want to thank you guys too for coming and thinking about this with us. I know that project management is not the most fun and exciting thing to kind of spend your afternoon on at MCM, but I think we all wouldn't be here if we didn't think it was really important and worthwhile and sort of interesting in its own way to those of us who practice it. So we really do appreciate your time, and we really do want to kind of talk through these questions with you, whatever they might be.
Anybody have a question? Anybody? 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 Okay, I'm gonna bring this to you. We gotta be.
Do we have any Twitter? We got a shout out for Basecamp.
Hello?
Just give him the mic and walk away.
I came in a little late, so I'm sorry if this was addressed, but I'm wondering if you're working with project managers in other departments, there sometimes can be sort of jealousy or suspicion, not in my institution, but at some. And I'm wondering if that's something that you have to deal with, and do you try to confront it head on, or do you sort of let it play out, and just sort of how do you handle sort of being careful and not, I mean, I've had colleagues call me and say, could you tell my boss that this meeting that we had was your idea? And I mean, which is bad, but I mean, it's a reality of workplaces. So I'm wondering how you deal with that.
I feel like sometimes project managers sort of become like the linchpin between things, and so sometimes it's me in my department and the project manager in the other department, and it's not always the other project manager who's the problem. It's like them communicating things to the people that they're managing versus me communicating things to the people and projects that I'm managing. And so I think I have been really trying to do this, I think with varying degrees of success in my new role, to make sure that the project managers don't, like, it doesn't stop with the other project managers, that they understand that, like, even if it's a project my department is doing, if it impacts people in their department, they still have to keep communicating that. They can't just kind of hold it in for them. And so sort of pushing them and reminding them is something I've been really trying to do there.
Yeah, there's a reason why we called it juggling, because it is a juggling act, and I think knowing who those people are, it's not going to be the same as what I'm doing with a certain person in one department versus someone in a different department. I handle them very differently, and that's something that's taken me several years at my old job to figure out all those personalities and how to get that done. And I know it's something that's going to take a while in my new position because it can be really, really challenging. So I wish there was a really easy way, but my way is I do tend to just talk to someone directly if I hear things through the grapevine.
I would agree with that. I think it sounds so negative, but confronting people head on is the way that you get things accomplished. And it goes back to building relationships. If you can avoid sending a crazy email that is all about accusing someone of doing something wrong versus just walking into their office and saying, let's talk this through, let's figure out what's going on, it's going to be so much better. In
person tends to be better than via email.
Yeah. And I say that because in my work as a project manager, I've dealt with many difficult personalities, and it's been a struggle to not send that email, but understand that it's okay to draft it and then delete it and then go have the conversation. And you're a better person because of it.
I think that's also where within your institution you really have to work on culture of transparency so that you can have the hard conversations. I mean, one of it is, if project managers aren't getting along, then it might be that they're not clear on what their roles are. If they're feeling threatened by not being involved in a certain project, there may be very good reason. So that's where, sometimes, we get our heads down and we stop communicating about a project because we're so focused on the tasks that we have to get done. But again, it's like, kind of like when you're playing soccer, you gotta lift your head up and look around and actually see what other people are doing. Because you can't do it alone, even though we have the tendency to, in the museum field, to kind of get our tasks, go to our desk, and try to do it alone, and we don't necessarily share all the successes and failures along the way. It's okay to say what's not working. It's okay to say what is working, and ultimately that'll end up helping the project.
And I think also, there are cases where you can't address it head on, that it's either a very difficult person or something about the relationship, just if there's a power inequity, that you just aren't able to do that. I think if you could bring it back around to the subject of the project, what are you trying to accomplish and what are your common goals? You don't really have to get into what's wrong with the dynamic, but maybe focus on what's wrong with the project and how can we work on that together to fix it, because some relationships just are difficult.
Any other questions? Comments? Needs to vent?
We can close the doors if
Yeah.
need be.
Yeah. Right page.
I don't have a question. I just want to say, how come
It's
nobody
on.
can ever hear themselves, right? A lot of you guys were talking on the panel about, working with external vendors and partners. And as somebody that works for one of those external vendors, partners, I just want to say how important it is to find the right fit. Like you said, you never met the developer, and there can be that lack of communication there. I think that's one of the most important pieces of advice that I could offer anybody that's working through web projects specifically, is just making sure you find a good partner, regardless of who it is.
Yeah, when you have a bad one, it can
can
feel
ruin
like
everything.
a breakup and be very uncomfortable. So finding out what you need is definitely really important, and it takes a while to kind of know about your own, not even just the institution, but your own needs, if you are that direct contact to get it done.
I had to break up with a contractor in the middle of a project, and it was very, very sad on them, not me. I was thrilled. But
And costly to start with somebody else.
yeah, and Laura and I actually worked at that same contractor.
We had
And-
different experiences, though.
Yes.
We had very different project managers, so
Yes.
that was all the difference.
But I had to break up with them, and it's one of those moments where you just have to say it for the good of the project. It's just like you're saying, you have to set those expectations of what you need, and again, knowing your audience, knowing your visitors. Is this going to get me? We're spending money on X, Y, and Z. Is this going to be the best fit for us? And then ultimately, you hopefully find a better fit, which we did.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
The next relationship was better.
Even if it takes longer sometimes to find the right person, or it might take longer to execute the project. I mean, I think you guys can all speak to how important it is just to find the right person, regardless of who it may be.
Yeah, and even sometimes you'll be in the position where you have to work with a vendor who's already been selected before you were there, and like worst case scenario, you learn things to help you pick your next one, the things that really bother you, and to meet the project manager and the team you'll actually be working with, and not just let them pitch you and those kinds of things.
We officially have 2 minutes left. Any other questions?
Oh, I've had that conversation. It was literally like a breakup. They're like, "What could I have done better?" It's like, "Oh, sorry, it's not you, but it is."
It's not you, it's me. It's really you. Anything else? Yeah.
You talk about the challenges of a project potentially never being done, but as somebody who also works with external consultants, how have you had any experience sort of trying to figure out when you've really changed from kind of that first scope to something potentially different? How do you release them back into the wild and let them be done with you while you really consider it a 2.0 iteration?
Yes.
Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, I
didn't
couldn't-
quite
Can
hear
you
it.
like rephrase loudly?
Sorry, I'm tired. So in working with external consultants, you often come up with a scope of work for a project, but if you are thinking in a more agile perspective, oftentimes that changes over the course of the time working with them. And it's something that I'm working on with, I want to advocate for my contractor, but I also want to advocate for what our museum needs. So how do you kind of make that moment of, thank you so much for delivering us up until this point, it's time for us to stop and reset, and having that conversation both with the consultant and with your internal team?
I try to be honest. I mean, of course, you can't always be completely honest about what's going on, but if things are confidential. But that's a big reality, and I know I've had to say it. It's not the fun conversation to have, but if it's a good working relationship, then you're hoping to pick things up or in a different way. And I've found when we've had to stop things, but it's not because of bad working relationship, but just because of the way things have happened, they understand.
Yeah.
And then we work on them with them later.
Sometimes we had this with the website that I was talking about. When I started at the Phillips, there was version 1.0, and it was meant to be a teacher resource website that was basically a database of lessons for teachers. And it was supposed to be built as a WordPress site. And all of a sudden, 3 months later, my supervisor and I had gone to a couple conferences, decided that's not what we wanted to do anymore. So we talked to some teachers, got some feedback, and our contractor, and so then in addition to that, our institution was going through a redesign and transitioning to a Drupal site. So no longer was it feasible for us to make a WordPress site. That was stupid. And so this contractor couldn't do a Drupal site. So sometimes it just has to do with technical ability, and it's easy to say, okay, well, thanks, but no thanks. Those wireframes are great, but maybe in a couple years. But again, keeping that really great working relationship is nice if you can maintain it, because we could have easily gone back to them at some point and had them redesign or redo or for a different project. I don't know if that really is helpful.
I think, one of the challenges with sort of a hybrid solution, or when you're working with third-party contractors where the deliverable is less defined, it is always managing, when we manage contracts or when I'm managing contracts, usually there's amendments that detail additional scopes. And certainly there are points with some producers that for one of the biggest challenges for our institution has been accessibility. Because a lot of external developers that we work with actually don't know how to do accessibility. They think they know how to do accessibility. But we often find that there's a huge education curve that ends up coming with that, and then sometimes the amount of hours that they're spending trying to understand the scope of WCAG compliance that we're looking for, we can get 3/4 of the way through the project and we've maxed out the budget, and it's hard to say we have to reset and accept the fact that this deliverable is now going to have to wait, or we have to do it as a release and plan on a future release. But that's also the nature of digital. Sometimes there's unforeseen changes in technology that make things completely different, and that's kind of par for the course, especially on 1 or 2 or 4-year projects. The longer the project, the more the risk of it changing as you're heading towards the finish line. But the other thing is that you'll usually end up seeing these providers at conferences like this. So it's always important that you have a good professional relationship with them.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all for being here. If you have any other questions, feel free to grab us.